Good morning, guys. Listen, we're going to have a great day today. It's going to be a productive day today. We're going to, in class, we're going to go through the rest of the Progressive Era lecture, which will be used to obviously help build test questions for the exam on Monday. And so want to make sure that on Monday that you have your DQs, your precedent chart, ready to go at that time. So again, I'm about to put on the Progressive Era lecture. Make sure you take notes, and I will have a Periscope tonight at 8 o'clock and a Periscope Sunday night at 8 o'clock. So as we go through today's lecture, if you come across any questions, be sure to write those down, and I will see you on Periscope. I hope to see a good deal of participation there, and let's make sure that we're cooperative and we're doing all the things we need to do today. So right now, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to transition over to my PowerPoint. Okay. So we go on. We're just going to kind of continue where we go. I'm going to try to minimize this as much as I can. I'm going to use this screen right here. And so, fantastic. Okay. So for the exam, for the Progressive Era, one thing that we've already covered that definitely you're going to be required to know is we want to understand what is progressivism. Who are the progressives? We understand that the progressive movement is very broad. It's made up of many different groups of people, often groups of people that have quite a bit of incompatibility with each other. And then look at the 5 features of progressivism. I can tell you that the 5 features of progressivism will be on the exam. And so for each of the 5 features, you are going to need to be able to explain what these mean. What is, so we're talking about democracy, more democracy. What does that look like? What does that mean? Why was one of the cornerstones of progressivism the need for more democracy? Government efficiency, regulation of giant corporations, social justice, and active government. Active government. Those are the 5 features. Now in class, we did address the need for more democracy. So I'm going to skip that. We also addressed government efficiency, the importance of, if we're going to use the government as a tool by which to fix the nation's social and economic injustices, we want that tool to be efficient. So make sure you're familiar with Frederick W. Taylor, who believed that the government should be, in administering social justice, the government will be more effective and will be able to help more people if the government is run like a factory, if it's run like a business. So that his ideas largely went into government efficiency during the period. Then we had the regulation of giant corporations. I believe that this is probably where we left off in class. The whole idea is the singular ideal that is reflected in the regulation of giant corporations is the big picture belief, big picture idea that monopolies have way too much power, and that that power needs to be destroyed and needs to be redistributed, and that we need to see the establishment once again of a free market economy, and recreation of competition to create a free market economy with competition. And the 2 processes by which progressives are going to do this, we're going to see it today. One is going to be trust busting, in the belief that restoring old-fashioned competition would be the best way to restore competition to the economy and to prevent economic abuses. And two, accepting big businesses as they are, but regulate them to the point to where abuses are prevented. And so we want to understand the driving force behind government regulation of the economy, of these giant corporations, trusts, and monopolies. Okay. The fourth attribute of progressivism is social justice. And so it says here a fourth important feature of the progressive spirit was the impulse towards social justice, which motivated diverse actions. You saw that in the speed dating activity. You saw how diverse these social justice movements were. Which motivated diverse actions from private charities to campaigns against child labor and liquor. The Settlement House movement a decade earlier had spawned a core of social workers and genteel reformers devoted to the uplift of slum dwellers. But with time, it became apparent that social evils extended beyond the reach of private charities and demanded the power of the state. The progressive found that the old codes of private ethics and accountability scarcely applied to a complex industrial order. So social justice cannot be carried out by charities. Charities are really incapable to deal with the injustices in American society on, because of the prevalence of these injustices on such a large scale. As one sociologist observed in 1907, he said, unlike the old-time villain, the latter-day malefactor does not wear a slouch hat and comforter, breathe forth curses and an odor of gin, go about his nefarious work with clenched teeth and an evil scowl. The modern high-powered dealer of woe wears immaculate linen, carries a silk hat, a lighted cigar, and sins with calm countenance and a serene soul. Leagues are miles from the evil he causes, and upon his gentlemanly presence, the eventual blood and tears do not obtrude themselves. So the problem is, in doing social justice, you're doing social justice against very powerful, as it says, the high-powered dealer of woe is, they wear fine linens, they carry silk hat, they're rich, they're wealthy, they're powerful, and so to go after these people, it's going to be a major challenge. Now, social justice takes two forms, okay? One is changing the name. So how can we, as progressives, help the most people, help the most amount of people in a very quick, efficient manner? And what can we do that can best benefit the lives of the working poor in a meaningful way? And the belief is reforming their work, reforming the work. As you can see here, reforming the work may involve shorter hours, more pay, job security, the right to unionize, safer work conditions, regulating working hours of women, and limiting or abolishing child labor. The second area of social justice is going to be prohibition. All right. So the cycle of poverty is, that drugs and alcohol. I mean, we can even extend this question to the modern day. How do you make a poor person poor? And more importantly, how do you keep a poor person poor? Addiction. Drugs and alcohol can take somebody in poverty and condemn them to a cycle of poverty where they're unable to break it. They're unable to break through. Sobriety equals freedom. As long as you're sober, you have your natural rights. You're a free thinker. When you're under the influence of a substance, you are no longer free. You are unable to make your own decisions, make your own choices. And so ultimately, the progressives believe that by eliminating alcohol from society, they are going to help break the cycle of addiction and poverty. for millions of working poor in the country. That is what social justice looks like. So I'm going to skip. I'm going to go to right here. So sometimes it takes tragedy in order to move people in the direction of social justice. And that event was the 1911 Triangle Shirtwaist Company fire, which the workers were largely young teenage girls working in this garment factory, and they the factory caught fire, and the bosses had a tradition of leaving, or a practice of leaving, locking the doors from the outside, and so these girls had no place to escape. There's evidence that these girls would, to try to save themselves, would jump out of fourth, fifth, sixth story, floors of the building, of the factory, literally with their hair on fire. And so as a result of the Triangle Shirtwaist Company, there were nearly 100 deaths, all of them teenage girls. And the American public demanded, as a result of this incident, they demanded justice. And so what came from the Triangle Shirtwaist Company is legislation, which dealt with improving work conditions across the United States. And the fifth feature, and this is pretty much a no-brainer, this is active government. The fifth feature of progressivism, and perhaps the most significant of all, and its long-term impact, was the emphasis on the public service functions of the government. Governments are now being called upon to extend a broad range of direct services to the people. In other words, the government is doing things for people that people used to do for themselves. And so in dealing with education, infrastructure, conservation, public health and welfare, and other things, active government, progressives promote an active, engaged government that is providing a whole host of direct services for people. And so, yeah, that's the fifth theme. So we look at progressivism, we're reminded that progressivism is the belief that efficient government could protect the public interest and bring order to society, could restore order to society. And so there's many different areas of reform that a lot of variety. Like I said, you really see this in the activity we did last class, the speed dating activity. So I think as you're preparing for the exam, I want you to address each of these areas of reform. Remember this chart here, this chart that I showed you the first day we covered this. I said, hey, listen, go to the Progressive Era Google site, go down here to the bottom. It says Progressive Era chart, and it's got the 2 stars. Okay, and so this chart essentially breaks down each area of progressive reform. You've got, for example, you got trust busting, which was really driven by the muckraking of Henry Demarest Lloyd, David Phillips, Ida Tarbell, Frank Norris, Upton Sinclair, Thorstein Veblen, and what came out of these works was trust busting. We have actual legislation that's going to be passed, which is going to work to destroy monopolies in this country. So go through and just give a once over, and you can see all the different areas that the progressives were concerned in, what they worked in, and what type of successful legislation did we have in each one. So I'm going to go back, okay, here. So we look at the different areas, the killing of political machines, right? So we got the killing of political machines. We've got trust busting, major goal, right? Consumer protection. Of course, with consumer protection, you're going to have the Pure Food and Drug Act and the Meat Inspection Act. You can thank Mr. Upton Sinclair for that one. voting reform, a way to try to clean up the political process. Female suffrage. Now, I want to take time, and I want to stop here, and I want to talk a little bit about female suffrage, the female suffrage movement. So, obviously, in 1848, the Seneca Falls Convention in New York was the beginning of the women's suffrage movement. Remember, it was led by Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott, and eventually Susan B. Anthony. By the late 19th century, the women's movement had basically split into two factions. It had split into two factions, and we had the National Women's Suffrage Association, which was led by Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, and then we had the American Women's Suffrage Association, led by Lucy Stone. And in 1893, these two organizations merged in what is called the National American Women's Suffrage Association. And so by 1890, women had won partial suffrage in 19 states, with Wyoming and Utah being the first states to grant suffrage beginning in 1869. So the National American Women's Suffrage Association grew from 13,000 in 1893 to 75,000 in 1910, and it was led by a woman by the name of Carrie Chapman Catt. Carrie Chapman Catt will become the most effective leader of this new generation of women suffrage proponents. And so the 19th Amendment is largely done and is largely secured due to her efforts and by enacting what she called the quote-unquote winning plan. This is a no-card term, and this is a term you're going to need to know. So the winning plan was essentially borrowed by women's rights leaders. It was borrowed from the British. British women will secure the right to vote before American women wholesale. And so Catt wanted to duplicate and essentially follow the example that was set by the British. And this is what we call the winning plan. So what is going to be the strategy that she's going to use to once and for all finally secure women's right to vote? And so it involved lobbying Congress, holding parades, public demonstrations. And when World War I broke out, she encouraged as many women to contribute to the war effort as they could in many different ways, whether it was working in the factories, working in the farms. But regardless, it was all about women making contributions in the war. And what the winning plan ultimately entailed was Catt's de-emphasizing the argument that women deserved the right to vote as a matter of right because they were equal to men in all respects. You see, what British women learned is that anytime you use the E word, anytime you use the word equality, men are less likely to comply. They're less likely to cooperate in providing women with the right to vote. But instead, what she did is she stressed that women should instead create different arguments for the right to vote in order to secure it. And of course, the argument of the war, their service in World War I, and number two, and probably more significant, is the women went to the politicians and demanded the vote because women knew that in order to get Prohibition passed, women votes were needed. And so they were able to use those arguments. Now, another women's rights leader, her name was Alice Paul. And she was very militant. She was fairly bitter, fairly salty. And she did not agree in this tactic of avoiding the word equality. She did not agree with the winning plan. Instead, I mean, really, you want to think Alice Paul, she was a woman who recruited the most militant women out of Carrie Chapman Catt's organization. What Paul is known for is putting forth what's called the Equal Rights Amendment, or the ERA, which was a proposed constitutional amendment that would have given women absolute equality with men. So at the end of the day, in 1920, the 19th Amendment passed, granted women full suffrage. The bill was put forth in the House of Representatives by Jeanette Rankin, who's the first woman ever to serve in Congress. So female suffrage, we definitely want to be familiar with that topic for the exam. So what you're doing, you're looking at these various causes, progressive causes, and in every one of these progressive causes, the progressives achieved great success. So you just need to be familiar with that. Okay. So now this gets us into the three progressive presidents. Okay, the first progressive president, we're going to address each of these individually. And so the first one we have here is Teddy Roosevelt. Teddy Roosevelt is often considered to be the first modern president. He was the first president in U.S. history to use the government to directly help the public interest. Okay, so he, little side story about Teddy Roosevelt. Little side story about Teddy Roosevelt. Number one, he was born and raised New York City. I think the Cowboy President, the outside reading, the Cowboy President really dives into his personal life, in his childhood growing up. But to make a long story short, he grew up physically weak. I mean, he couldn't see very well. He had asthma. He was, I think, what you would describe as a runt. And but that really doesn't, and he wasn't allowed to go outside and play, and because of the pollution upset his asthma. And so he oftentimes spent most of his childhood in the house, locked in the house. And so that's really going to influence his career down the road, and I hope you see that. Well, as a young man, of course, he went to Harvard, graduated from Harvard, came home to New York, got married, and on Valentine's Day, both his wife and his mother died on the same day. And it sent Roosevelt kind of spiraling into depression, and went out west. He went out west. He went out to Montana. He went and lived the life of a rancher. Lived among the Indians and lived among the ranch hands, and he really developed out west the flair of a cowboy. This cowboy image of a rugged outdoorsman, fiercely independent. It really helped to shape him. And so eventually he returns to New York. He becomes police commissioner in New York City, gets appointed as the Assistant Secretary of the Navy, and he's going to begin the process of building that world-class Navy that Alfred Thayer Mahan promoted in his book, Influence of Sea Power Upon America. When the war broke out, the Spanish-American War broke out, he went to McKinley and asked permission to go fight in Cuba, to go fight the Spanish, and McKinley said no. Roosevelt's kind of guy doesn't like to be told no, so he leaves Washington. He telegraphs his friends in Montana, saying, "Hey, listen, I'm forming a regiment. I want to go fight in Spain. I want to go. We're gonna go fight independently on our own. I want you to join me. Here, meet me in San Antonio, and we'll leave. From there all together." So this regiment of Montana ranchers was called the Rough Riders, and they hopped a boat in Tampa, Florida, went to Cuba, and Teddy Roosevelt, leading the Rough Riders, rode into history, becomes a national hero, and by 1900 is now, he returns home, wins the governorship of New York, where he establishes himself into a very successful progressive in the state of New York. He then oh my goodness, sorry. All right, so he then hey Sammy, can you turn that down just a little? So sorry. So then he I forgot where I was at. Okay, so he becomes New York. Okay, the party bosses in New York didn't like the fact that this young upstart, this national hero from the war, was reforming New York politics. So what he did is the party leaders in New York pulled strings to see to it that he become vice president of the United States, to get him out of New York. And so in 1901, William McKinley is going to be assassinated. And now, as what Democratic leader Mark Hanna said, now that damned cowboy is president. And so he never shakes the image of the cowboy. And oftentimes in political cartoons, and as you can see in this picture here, he is always portrayed as the Rough Rider, as the image of the cowboy. It's kind of built into his identity. So Roosevelt, when he emerges as president, his progressivism is called the square deal. And you need to know the square deal. We know the square deal by what we call the 3 C's: conservation of natural resources, consumer protection, and the control of trusts. Now, Roosevelt, his version of reform was one of caution. Now, what we mean by caution is that he's not a bleeding heart liberal. He is a progressive, but he's not a bleeding heart. You'd have to describe Roosevelt's progressivism as moderate. He's fairly moderate on the progressive scale. He was very successful in cultivating party leaders in Congress, and steered away. He was able to steer away from such political meat grinding issues such as the tariff, banking issues. And when he did approach the explosive issue of trust, he always took care to reassure the business community. So according to Teddy Roosevelt, as you can see here, this is big. The goal of reform was to protect the public interest. Roosevelt acted in large part out of the conviction that reform was needed to keep things on an even keel. Control should rest in the hands of sensible Republicans and not with the irresponsible Democrats, or worse, the growing socialist movement. So he supports reform because, socialism is creeping. Roosevelt will accomplish more by aggressive executive action than by passing legislation. And the president, he believed, can do anything not expressly forbidden by the Constitution. So Roosevelt, a lot like Lincoln and other presidents, felt like the Constitution restrained him in his job. So let's look through the 3 C's. The first C is regulation of corporations. And we have different examples. In 1902, he intervenes in a really paralyzing coal mine strike. Coal is the life and blood of the American economy. It's what drives the railroads. It's what drives the factories. And anytime coal miners went on strike, it caused paralysis in the American economy. He invites both the mine owners and the labor leaders to negotiate a settlement in Washington. The mine owners refuse. They refuse to negotiate with the labor leaders. So Roosevelt will threaten to seize the mines and operate them with federal troops if the owners refused to compromise with the labor leaders. So the strike, he believed, threatened the public interest. And so on behalf of the American people, and really on behalf of the miners are going to come out of this negotiation in Washington with a 10% pay increase. And in order to settle future labor disputes, Roosevelt created in 1903 the Department of Commerce and Labor to settle disputes between bosses and their workers. 10 years later, the Department of Commerce and Labor will be split into two separate agencies. And so let's see, what else do we had? He also created what was called, and it's not listed here, it's called the Bureau of Corporations. It was created to monitor businesses in interstate commerce. It helped to break monopolies, and it paved the way for an era of trust busting. That's called the Bureau of Corporations. In 1902, Roosevelt attacked the Northern Securities Company, number 3 up here. Okay, so the holding company was owned by J.P. Morgan and railroad man James G. Hill. It had achieved a monopoly of railroads in the Northwest. The Supreme Court essentially the Northern Securities Act or Company is significant because this is the first company that Roosevelt trust busts. Okay, he's going to destroy it. He's going to break it up. It's viewed as a monopoly. He's going to break it up. The Supreme Court upheld this in 1904. And now the public views Roosevelt as a trust buster. So in 1905, the Supreme Court further declared that the beef trust was illegal. The sugar fertilizer and harvester trusts also came to be regulated by antitrust legislation in later years. Roosevelt later on went after DuPont, Standard Oil, and American Tobacco Company. So he's a bit of a trust buster. And the big thing with Roosevelt is he distinguished between good trusts and bad trusts. He thought that we should only destroy the monopolies that are guilty of the most injustice, and that the good the companies, the monopolies that are actually providing good, they're great benefits to the economy, they should be left alone, but that they should be regulated. He also, if you see here, number 4 and 5, those are examples of railroad regulation. So he not only went after trusts, but he also regulates the railroads. The second C is consumer protection. And so that, of course, leads to 2 laws, the Meat Inspection Act of 1906 and the Pure Food and Drug Act. The Pure Food and Drug Act prevented the adulteration and mislabeling of foods and drugs. So this law was the first step in the direction of nutritional labels that are required on all packaged foods sold today. So these are 2 landmark pieces of legislation aimed at protecting the American consumer, protecting the public interest. And the third is going to be conservation of natural resources. This is big. I think Roosevelt really developed an affinity for the West during his time out there. The Yellowstone National Park was created as the first national park, the nation's first national park in 1872. And Yosemite received the designation as a national park in 1890. And of course, Roosevelt wanted this to continue. One of the most influential conservationists at the time, and really in all of American history, is a note card term by the name of John Muir. John Muir, there he is. John Muir. He's the one who led the effort to protect Yosemite, and later co-founded the Sierra Club. The Sierra Club is the nation's most respected conservation organization in the United States. And Roosevelt, as a conservationist, remember, Roosevelt was an outdoorsman and was appalled at the devastation of timber and mineral resources in some of the nation's forests. He hires a man by the name of Gifford Pinchot right here, this guy, to head the division of the forestry. He had made significant contributions before Roosevelt had become president. He sought a wise use policy. And so what conservation means is that we're going to use raw materials, but we're going to do it in a wise, we're going to do it wisely. You can see other legislation. You can see the creation of national parks. Roosevelt is going to set aside national forests. He's going to create wildlife refuges, bird sanctuaries. So this is, without a doubt, one of Roosevelt's most tangible contributions, where today we, this is his legacy. I mean, I think today, every time you go to Yosemite or you go to Yellowstone or Glacier, Petrified Forest, Grand Canyon, you know, when you go to these national parks, what you're looking at is his legacy. You're looking at his legacy. So, and as he said, I love this quote, he says, "I hate a man who will skin the land." So anyway, so in 1904, Roosevelt wins re-election. This is William Jennings Bryan's third loss. Eugene Debs ran a strong, it was a strong third place finisher. And Roosevelt made himself a lame duck president by announcing after his election that he would not seek a third term. You know, it was debatable because he hadn't really served 2 full terms after McKinley's death. So he pretty much said, hey, listen, this is my last go around. You can see the election map in 1904 and how Americans are still kind of voting along those same Civil War voting patterns. Now, the big thing with Roosevelt in his second term is the economy tanks. The economy tanks. We have an economic downturn. It's called the Panic of 1907. Roosevelt blames Wall Street for it. He blames speculators and mismanagement on Wall Street. Others blamed Roosevelt in his anti-business tactics. The important thing is that during this panic, this gave Roosevelt reason to embark on a new wave of trust busting. And he did it at a very large scale. He did it in a very large scale. So this created obviously a lot of bitterness between Roosevelt and the business community. Right here. Okay, so the second progressive president is Republican William Howard Taft. He is Teddy Roosevelt's handpicked successor, as this cartoon illustrates. As Roosevelt is leaving office, you can see he's handing over to Mr. Taft the baby, which on that little napkin, on the little diaper, says "my policy." So Roosevelt, it's important that you know this, guys, that Roosevelt intended Taft to be his successor. He expected Taft to be just as progressive as Roosevelt was. It's also interesting to see down here that the porter is actually taking out of the White House the whole big stick. So the whole big stick, that metaphor for Roosevelt foreign policy, it's also leaving, as William Howard Taft is really into dollar diplomacy. There he is. Old William Taft. Okay. He defeats William Jennings Bryan. This is now William Jennings Bryan. This is his fourth loss in the presidential election. Once out of office, still only 50, Roosevelt left on a big game hunt in Africa, prompting his foe, J.P. Morgan, to mutter, quote, "Let every lion do his duty." The new president he left behind was an entirely different kind of political animal. In fact, hardly an political animal at all. The presidency was the only elective office that Taft had ever held. And later on, he would be Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. Wilson will appoint him as Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, which was a job that was a little bit more suitable to his skill set. He loved golf. He loved playing poker, but he detested politics. He once said, "Politics, when I'm in it, makes me sick." He never felt comfortable in the White House, and he once observed that whenever somebody said, "Mr. President," he would always look around for Roosevelt. So the political dynamo of the family was his wife, Nellie, who wanted the White House more than her husband. So to what extent is Taft a progressive? One of the things you're going to need to know here, and this is a big point, okay? We're going to have what's called the Taft Betrayal. The Taft Betrayal. The fact is that Taft isn't quite as progressive as Roosevelt thought he would be. Taft is going to generate a storm of controversy within his own party. And during this period, of course, the Republican Party is going to implode. It's going to break into two different wings. And so we'll talk about how that happens. So what did Taft do to contribute to what we call the Taft Betrayal? And so one of the first ones is the Payne-Aldrich Tariff, as you see here. This is the most important cause for the 1912 split of the Republican Party. Reducing the tariff was a major goal of progressive reformers. Taft's campaign had pledged to deal with the tariff issue. The House passed a moderately reductive bill, but the Senate tacked on hundreds of upward tariff revisions. Taft signed the bill, thus betraying his campaign promises, alienating progressives, and of course he would later veto other attempts to lower the tariff. So they lowered the tariff. The House lowers the tariff, but the Senate tacks on tariff enhancements. And Taft goes along with it. And so this is one issue where you have a betrayal. We have a betrayal. He's going to align himself with what we call, you see in here, the old guard Republicans. You're going to find that Taft is going to align himself with moderate Republicans and not the old progressive Republicans. And the second thing he does is he fires Pinchot, the conservationist, and replaces him with a man by the name of Richard Ballinger. Richard Ballinger was a guy who, let's put it right here, he was not really strong on conservation. In fact, he is going to begin to attack wise use. He engages in unethical land sales. He begins to lease coal beds to political insiders. He took national forest lands and leased them away to logging companies. And so we also see under Taft a reversal when it comes to conservation policy. But the one area Where Taft, no doubt, is progressive is in trust busting. He was a trust busting fool. Unlike Roosevelt, he did not distinguish between good trusts and bad trusts. In all, he brought nearly 90 antitrust lawsuits against monopolies, including American Tobacco, U.S. Steel, and Standard Oil. And which irritated Roosevelt. Roosevelt thought those companies ought to be left alone. Roosevelt returns home from his travel abroad in June of 1910. He had been reading the news accounts and letters about the Taft Betrayal, but unlike some of his supporters, he refused to break with Taft. And when Roosevelt returns to the United States, Taft invites Roosevelt for dinner at the White House, and Roosevelt basically turned him down, saying, quote, "I shall keep my mind open as I keep my mouth shut." So he wasn't very happy with Taft. He was very disappointed with Taft. Around the same time, this is important to note as well, Roosevelt begins going on a speaking tour, campaigning for Republican candidates from around the United States. And as he's delivering this speech, he's delivering a stump speech called New Nationalism. Now, New Nationalism, you're going to need to know this. This is something that will be on the test. In the New Nationalism, what you got to understand is that by this time, Roosevelt is no longer a moderately progressive president. Now he's very, very liberal. He's a lot more liberal than he had ever been. Excuse me. Than he had ever been before. He issued a stirring call for an array of new federal regulatory laws, new measures of direct democracy, including old populist demands for initiative, recall, and referendum. In fact, if you look at this document here, this is actually on your Google site, the comparison between New Nationalism and New Freedom, something you're going to need to be able to do. His position under New Nationalism, as you can see here, is, there we go, it says that concentration in industry is inevitable, and therefore federal control is necessary to protect the working man, and national interest requires that property be regulated. When it comes to social justice, New Nationalism meant that he supported a minimum wage law for women, a federal child labor law. He supported enlarging the conservation program and using the federal government to resolve labor problems. We will come back and look at this when we look at Woodrow Wilson. So he's going around, he's giving this speech, and people are going, wow, gee, Roosevelt must have spent a lot of time in Europe, because he's definitely come back a lot more liberal than he's ever used to be, But he does. He becomes more progressive. And relations begin to fall apart between Taft and Roosevelt. And it really came down when Taft filed an antitrust lawsuit against U.S. Steel, which is one of those quote-unquote good trusts that Roosevelt thought should be left alone. So Roosevelt decides to challenge Taft in the primaries and to re-enter politics. Now, we go back up here, when he's going up here and he's traveling around the United States, campaigning for Republicans, one thing that he realizes is that how much he missed politics. He missed the crowds, he missed the attention. So he runs for president. He is back into politics. And so Roosevelt's entry into the presidential race in 1912 wasn't really wholeheartedly supported by Republicans. Robert La Follette had already entered the race to challenge Taft, and eventually La Follette's support dwindled as Taft's major challenge was former President Roosevelt. The rebuke of Taft and Roosevelt's decision to run was essentially the number one reason in his decision to run against Taft, his chosen successor. And in many ways, it's unfair. I think Taft gets a bit of a bum rap. He is a lot more progressive than way Roosevelt would have preferred, but Think about what he did do. Taft took on the tariff issue, an issue that Roosevelt ducked. He appointed conservationist men with impeccable credentials in conservation matters. He had the power to protect public lands for any reason. He's the first president to withdraw oil lands from use. He enlarged the national forests and that were protected. And he brought nearly, well, actually the number's 90. He brought nearly 90 antitrust lawsuits compared to Roosevelt's 25. So Taft gets a bit of a bum rap. And by running for president again, now he's screwing around with George Washington's two-term principle. You know, something about those Roosevelts. Those Roosevelts really aren't into abiding by the two-term presidency. So in 1912, we have 4 people running for president. Okay, we have 4 people. You got Roosevelt, who's running as, by the way, Roosevelt loses in the primaries. Taft beats him in the Republican primaries, so Roosevelt decides to run as the third party. And he runs as what's called the Bull Moose Progressive Party. It's called the Bull Moose Party. Essentially, it's a party of progressive Republicans. And Taft tended to represent the other wing of the party that was a little bit more aligned with what we call the old guard, or the moderate wing of the Republican Party. Here you can see riding the elephant. Next to him, with the goat, that's Eugene Debs, the socialist. In 1912, Eugene Debs gets 1 million votes for the first time. So that's kind of creepy. And then here we have Woodrow Wilson, the Democratic governor of New Jersey. And we're going to talk about him in just a second. So in 1912, having lost the Republican nomination, Roosevelt runs as a third-party candidate. He's the Bull Moose guy. He runs under the whole new nationalism pledge. And again, this document is on the Google site, talking about what is new nationalism. It's something you really need to explore, okay? Really need to explore that. So, but he's taken on a progressive governor from New Jersey, Woodrow Wilson. Woodrow Wilson is running on a platform called New Freedom. And New Freedom emphasized small business, entrepreneurship, and a return to a free, competitive economy without monopolies. So he's really, when you look at New Freedom, what New Freedom means, okay, is what Wilson's talking about. New Freedom, he's talking about, in using the word freedom, he's basically saying that the monopolies have taken freedom out of the economy. There is no more freedom. There's no freedom to start a business. It's hard to get started on the ground floor. It's hard to be an entrepreneur because the monopolies have all the power in the country. So New Freedom is about giving American small businessmen, American entrepreneurs, freedom that had been taken away from them by the monopolies in order to go into business. So his concentration, he disagreed with Roosevelt that he says the concentration in industry is inevitable. In other words, monopolies. And Wilson disagrees. The concentration in industry is not inevitable. He believes that the laboring man must be free from all control, either federal or corporate. He pushed for free competition. He believed that free competition will destroy monopolies. And when it comes to social justice, this is one thing you can definitely make a good comparison, is that Wilson is not a social justice guy. He's not a guy who believes in social justice. He is more concerned about restoring freedom back into the economy. He's more of an economist, not much of a social. So they disagree. He's not, so you're not going to see Woodrow Wilson pushing for minimum wage or for child labor legislation or even conservation. He's more into economic freedom and restoring economic freedom. for the United States economy, within the United States economy. So I would like to now transition over here to Woodrow Wilson. I'm not going to go through this whole thing, but I will point out, we'll talk a little bit about the third president. So what do we have? We've got two progressive presidents. We have two Republicans, Roosevelt and Taft, and now we've got a Democrat from New Jersey, Mr. Thomas Woodrow Wilson. As it says here, the emergence of Thomas Woodrow Wilson as the Democratic nominee in 1912 climaxed a political rise even more rapid than that of Grover Cleveland. In 1910, before his nomination, he had been elected governor of New Jersey. Before that, he had been president of Princeton University. He's one of the only American presidents to be a PhD. Of course, it's in economics and government. He was born in Staunton, Louisiana, or Virginia in 1856. So Woodrow Wilson is the first Southerner to be elected president since the Civil War. We've gone that long without electing a Southerner into the White House. He was the son of a noble, saintly mother and a stern Presbyterian minister. He had grown up in Georgia and in the Carolinas during the Civil War and Reconstruction. Young Wilson was tall, slender, a bit awkward, with a lean, long, sharp, chiseled face. He inherited his father's unquestioning piety, once declaring that, quote, "So far as religion is concerned, argument is adjourned." Wilson also developed a consuming ambition to serve humanity, driven by a sense of destiny and duty, as well as by a certain moral vastedness, and once confessed, quote, "I am too intense." Now, I mentioned this in the World War I lecture, but I'm going to piggyback on it. Wilson was extremely righteous. He was very elite. He felt like, righteousness is essentially this idea that you're never wrong. He was stubborn. He was inflexible. He was not a very good compromiser. He was a my way or the highway type of guy. And this actually would prove to be, as it says here, it actually will prove to be his Achilles heel. Okay, it's maybe one of his weaknesses as a president. As a leader, he's the graduate, like I said, graduate of Princeton. Got his went to Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore, got a PhD in congressional government. That was the name of his dissertation, in which he promoted an active government with the president as a party leader. Like Roosevelt, he was critical of big business, organized labor, socialists, and your radical farmers, those old radical socialist farmers. So Roosevelt thought that labor unions can often are kind of like troublemakers, excessive things. So he shared Roosevelt's concern that politicians should promote the general welfare rather than narrowly serve their own special interests. So I think that's pretty good to say. He believed that it was the government's responsibility to pass good laws, and the president must provide good leadership in order for Congress to be effective. He was very successful as a governor and a president by bypassing the legislature and appealing directly to the people. So I mentioned it in the World War I unit. He was a very good speaker, a deep baritone voice, and was very charismatic. And because of his ability to speak and to communicate, he was able to bypass the Congress and the legislature and appeal directly to the people in order to get legislation passed. Now, Wilson was a raging racist, a white supremacist. He's the guy who's going to bring Jim Crow to the federal government. The reason why we had separate white bathrooms and black bathrooms in federal buildings was because of Woodrow Wilson. Woodrow Wilson also vetoed anti-lynching legislation. And his favorite movie was Birth of a Nation, which glorified the KKK. So he did support efforts to improve. In fact, that's one of the big failures of progressivism. One of the big failures of progressivism was the fact is that none of the progressives did anything to promote racial justice. So, so in 1910, he becomes governor of New Jersey, where he builds for himself a very strong record as governor. You can see all the different reforms that he pushed. Now that's kind of cool, because New Jersey was considered, it was once called the home of the trusts, the home of the monopolies. So, okay, so in 1912 he wins, and of course it's that whole new nationalism versus new freedom. It's, you know, really the election came down between Roosevelt and Wilson, and so 1912 is the first election to feature presidential primaries. Okay, so I'm not going to go through this line by line. This PowerPoint is on my Google site. It's not something really that you're going to need to commit to memory. But it was, I mean, I think you do see in 1912 the resurgence of the South. Southern politicians are going to be elected back into power for the first time since the Civil War. And so a lot of it has to do with this division in the Republican Party between the Roosevelt wing, you know, the Bull Moose wing, and the old guard, you know, the Taft wing of the Republican Party. So let's see, okay, right here. So what Wilson's progressive reforms, they were rooted in what we call the triple wall of privilege, the 3 T's: tariffs, treasury reform, and trusts. So all 3 presidents are really deeply engaged in trust busting. Taft demonstrated the most vigor when it came to this. However, Wilson, being a Democrat, has got a different agenda. He's going to address issues that many of these Republicans don't. And so the first one's going to be tariff reform. Okay, in an unprecedented move, Wilson called Congress into special session in early 1913, and he read his message in person rather than by a clerk, in which he called for a reduction of the tariff from 37% to 29%. This is called the Underwood Tariff Bill. There it is, the Underwood Tariff Bill. It reduced the Payne-Aldrich tariff. It did lead in a shortfall of revenue, and Wilson was able to make up the shortfall of revenue by also putting into law the 16th Amendment, the income tax. Okay, the income tax. So it's a graduated income tax, which means that the people at the top pay a higher rate than the people at the bottom. And essentially, if you're wondering, the first income tax, if you made over $4,000, you paid an income tax of 1%. And if you made over $500,000, you paid an income tax of 7%. So that is very, very low. So when the income tax was implemented, it's not the draconian figures that we have today. So anyway, crazy, crazy stuff. Okay, so the next important bill, the next important T, Treasury, is going to have to do with banking reform. And here, the most significant banking legislation in American history is in 1913. It's called the Federal Reserve Act. Federal Reserve Act created the Federal Reserve System. Okay, you got to play. If you got to play this back, you got to play this back. But you make sure that you understand what the Federal Reserve is. The nation's existing national banking system, which had been enacted during the Civil War, showed its weakness during the Panic of 1907, with its inability to regulate the money supply effectively. Wilson, monetary reserves were concentrated in New York, and a few other large cities, and could not be mobilized in times of financial stress to areas that were depressed. Wilson appeared dramatically for the second time in Congress, pushing for a sweeping reform of the banking system. Okay, and of course, this becomes one of the most significant economic legislation passed between the Civil War and the New Deal. It carried the United States through the financial crises of World War I. It established a solid financial foundation of a new economic age, this new industrial age. And yet, through poor management in the 1920s, it helped bring on the Great Depression. So it wasn't perfect. Some political scientists often call the Federal Reserve the fourth branch of government because of its power. So basically, the basic provisions of the Federal Reserve Act is it created a Federal Reserve Board, which would be appointed by the President of the United States and would oversee a nationwide system of 12 regional reserve districts, each having a central bank. Regional banks would be owned by member financial institutions, and final authority of the Federal Reserve Board guaranteed substantial measure of public control. And so the Federal Reserve was empowered with the responsibility of issuing paper money. That's what gives the Federal Reserve, the Fed for short, that's what gives the Fed its power, is that it has the power to issue paper money. And it's separated from the government so that it's not going to be tainted by politicians. And so the third area, the third T, is going to be monopoly reform. And those two things he will enact in 1914 aimed at attacking the trusts. The first one, as you can see here, is the Federal Trade Commission. It empowered a presidential appointed commission to monitor industries and interstate commerce. And it had the power to issue what are called cease and desist orders. And commissioners, the Federal Trade Commission, the commissioners could end unfair trade practices, unlawful competition, false advertising, mislabeling of products, and in addition to other unethical practices. So the FTC is a very powerful regulatory agency designed to be kind of a watchdog of American corporations, American big businesses. And the second law is the Clayton Antitrust Law. And the Clayton Antitrust Act of 1914 strengthened the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890 by increasing the list of unfair business practices, including price discrimination and interlocking directorates. A big one here, a big component of the Clayton Antitrust Act is that it exempted labor and agricultural organizations from antitrust action. Remember, under the Sherman Antitrust Law, the Sherman Antitrust Act was used more to just break the backs of unions than it was to break the back of corrupt monopolies. The leader of the AFL, the American Federation of Labor, Samuel Gompers, hailed the Clayton Antitrust Act as the Magna Carta of labor because of this. All right, so other important Wilson legislation, of course, you've got the Workmen's Compensation Act, which helped workers who got hurt at work. We see a Child Labor Act, which eventually the Supreme Court will overturn, will strike down. The Adamson Act. The Adamson Act actually established the 40-hour work week and allowed for overtime with pay. It established the 8-hour workday for all employees on trains and interstate commerce. Not the 40-hour work week. I'm sorry, I was wrong. And of course, the creation of a minimum wage. Now, during the Progressive Era, the Supreme Court was still very conservative. The Supreme Court was full of Gilded Age judges, which sought to overturn many Progressive era gains. And Wilson does leave his impact on the court by appointing a progressive thinker by the name of Louis Brandeis as a justice on the Supreme Court. Okay. All right, so we've talked about the prohibition of alcohol and the Women's Christian Temperance Union and Francis Willard and the emergence of the Anti-Saloon League and really trying to shut down those places of business. We're introduced to women of the likes of Carrie Nation. You know, Carrie Nation's the old lady who brought around the hatchet and would enter saloons and use that hatchet to destroy liquor, destroy barrels of beer and other types of booze. Prohibition, we also see during Prohibition the passing of dry laws where, we have in the United States, even today, what are called dry counties, where you still cannot manufacture, you cannot buy, you can consume it, but you can't manufacture and you cannot buy alcohol in these dry counties. And so the government eventually is going to have some success in Prohibition by passing what is called the Volstead Act. The Volstead Act is going to be the congressional law that gives us Prohibition. And of course, that law is going to be ratified by the 18th Amendment. It's going to be put in the Constitution of the United States. So we will address the Booker T. Washington, W.B. Du Bois feud. But I think it's important, however, to really talk about one of the major failures of progressivism is that they really ignore the issue of increased rights for African Americans. They don't attack segregation and Jim Crow. And so in the face of this, African American leaders are going to become emboldened to act. If the government isn't going to act, then African American leaders were. And so there's a number of people I want you to be familiar with. One is Ida B. Wells, who became an influential leader in pushing for laws to increase the penalties of lynching. And so anti-lynching laws will actually appear on Woodrow Wilson's desk only to find that those laws will be vetoed by President Wilson. We also see during this period really hundreds of thousands of blacks leaving the South, migrating to northern cities, and really throughout the period and really going into the Roaring 20s, we're going to have race riots. So we've got a lot of race issues, a lot of race problems during this period. And of course, the whole Du Bois versus Washington debate. These two guys are civil rights leaders, but they hate each other's guts. And so, but because the progressives failed in addressing the problems of Black America, these two leaders emerge. And so eventually we are going to need to understand that Du Bois established the NAACP. He promoted the concept of the talented 10th and created what was called the Niagara Movement. So those are note card terms that we're going to need to be familiar with. Booker T. Washington is synonymous with the Atlanta Compromise and the Tuskegee Institute in Alabama. So the African American issue, it's important, and it is obviously one of the glaring failures of the progressive movement, the progressive era. So when we look at the overall impact of progressivism, progressivism had a bit of a dark side to it. Progressives were criticized for attempting to impose their middle-class white Anglo-Saxon values on all of society. So a lot of these reformers were white Anglo-Saxon Protestants who were trying to force onto non-white Anglo-Saxon Protestants their values. Progressives also often supported the segregation of blacks to prevent social tensions. Progressives become increasingly nativist and supported harsh anti-immigration laws in the 1920s. Some progressives even supported the racist KKK in the 1910s and the 1920s. Another dark side of progressivism were the progressive attempts to legislate morality by trying to impose prohibition on the American people, which, you know, it was called, prohibition was called the noble experiment, but that noble experiment was a glorious failure. It fell short. Prohibitionists, progressive trust in science led to the extreme practice of eugenics, the attempt to eliminate crime, insanity, and other defects through selective breeding. It gave white supremacy the endorsement of science. And so really, I think a person we throw in here is Margaret Sanger, who introduces birth control. She supported eugenics, supported the idea of only certain people breeding, and helping to deal with social issues. Progressives also resided over the Red Scare of 1919 to 1920, which is one of the ugliest Red Scares, where we see some of the ugliest violations of civil liberties in American history. But at the same time, the progressives under Roosevelt, Taft, and Wilson achieved enormous results. They achieved enormous results. And, you know, you take the country during the Progressive Era at its very worst, and then you take the country under the Progressives at its very worst, and it was a considerable improvement than what we had going on in the United States. Well, we had going on at that time. The Progressive Era will come to an end in 1920. What causes the pendulum to swing, as I mentioned in World War I, in the World War I discussion, they blame Woodrow Wilson for getting the United States involved in the First World War, which they ultimately believed was a mistake, something that America should never have done, never should have been a part of. And the second event that caused the pendulum to shift in 1920, ushering in a conservative 1920s, what we call the Roaring Twenties, was Prohibition. The banning of the manufacture, the sale, the consumption, and the transportation of alcohol. Prohibition. And so that's it for the Progressive Era. Again, I will be on Periscope. I'll be on Periscope tonight and on Sunday night. So I hope to see you there. Come with questions. Make sure you have your DQs. Make sure you have your president chart, your notes. Make sure you're taking notes on this stuff that we're doing today. The notes that you're taking in class today, I expect to see when I grade your notes on Monday. So again, put in the time, put in the work, and I'll see you on. I'll see you soon. See you soon. You guys have a great day. Have a great weekend, and make sure that you're keeping ahead on your calendars, because we do have the next installment of the Jungle annotations coming up soon. So don't let that sneak up on you and catch you. All right, so make sure that you're doing your due diligence with the jungle. And when I get back next week, we get through this exam, we will do the Roaring Twenties and the Great Depression, and then we have spring break. Hallelujah. Hallelujah. So again, have a great one, guys. I'm proud of your hard work and your efforts. Make sure you're putting in good time. And I hope to see you at the Periscope. Bye.